Hey everybody, welcome to Zoom In on the Issues. Number 2, your privacy and data. We are here with Dr. Erin McCain, who's the director of the School of English and Communication Arts at North Central University. For the past 15 years, Dr. McCain has been building college programs in digital ethics for Hamline University, Ohio State University, and McGraw-Hill. He is currently a visiting scholar at Indiana University's Kelley School of Business. Also, Dr. Daniel Schneider is a lecturer of philosophy at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. Professor Schneider has previously served as a lecturer of philosophy at Haifa University and Cambridge University. And also Thomas Freeman, he's an adjunct professor of law and business at Creighton University. Mr. Freeman is a practicing attorney and a former assistant attorney general for the state of Nebraska. For the past year, Professors McCain, Schneider, and Freeman have been working with the Institute for Digital Humanity, a student-run think tank dedicated to a more just, equitable, and constitutional post-digital world. With the students of the IDH, they are currently developing a national high school curriculum on privacy and algorithmic discrimination for the Anti-Defamation League, and advising lawmakers and programmers on the ethical use of digital technology. Welcome, guys. Welcome those in the audience. Let's just get started with this. Is my iPhone listening to me?
Google, and then Google, what does Google know about you? And there are articles where you can read all the data it collects. There are actually links you can click on where you can access and download all the information Google has about you. And for just about everybody out there, it's gigabytes of data. So everywhere you've ever been, everyone you've interacted with, everything you've downloaded, every website you've been to, where you were at what times, who might have been there with you. It's pretty appalling the amount of data that's out there, and people aren't aware of it at all.
And I think to piggyback on that, I think Professor Freeman's making a really good point. I think Professor Barrett, one of the reasons we're really happy to talk tonight is that for a lot of us who've been doing work in privacy and digital ethics for a long time, I've been doing this for a decade and a half, the first 10 years of digital technology, you basically had to spend all your time convincing people that, yes, this is really happening, and no, grandma, you're not crazy, that Facebook's giving you these ads about a product that you were just talking about or something you just searched for. Now, especially after COVID, everyone understands that their data is being surveilled and used and sort of algorithmically analyzed every day. And I think people are finally starting to understand this second really trickier part, which is that in our Internet of Things, when everything from my toaster to my phone to my car to my school is, in the end of the day, collecting digital data, this idea that is my phone listening to me might actually be the least of our concerns. And pretty soon it's going to be things like, is the movie theater really taking my temperature to make sure I have COVID or don't have COVID? Did my high school really just facially scan me before I could attend classes? Did my college really dig through my social media posts from when I was 10 years old to decide whether to give me financial aid? So I think it's great now that people are aware of these issues, because we can actually finally start working with the legislatures and the companies to get us back to a kind of a more ethical and sane post-digital America.
I think it's terrifying. I think people don't realize that when they click on their terms of service for Facebook Farm Bill that these things are happening. Let me just pause for a second. For all those who are here in attendance, we're so glad you're here. If you have a question, don't put it in the chat, raise your hand. That's the way we're going to do it. If you raise your hand, then we'll bring you into the conversation. You can ask your question, join the conversation. That's better than putting it in the chat. We will scan chat, and Katie might bring up some stuff, but if you have a question, raise your hand and we'll allow you to talk. So I'd like to break this into two main sides. One, what is the government's role in this? And then what is the private industry? I look at those as two very different things. And let's start with private industry. So Google captures all this stuff on me. Is that regulated at all?
Tom, you want to start with this one, and then Dan probably can talk about the dangers of the state having this kind of data. But Tom, you want to give them the laydown on sort of digital ethics law in a commercial context?
Yeah, I sure can. The problem we have, Rob, is twofold. First of all, in other countries, other continents, other communities like the EU, they have fairly universal regulation of data. In the US, there's nothing really being done at a federal level. You have kind of bits and pieces here and there, like you have HIPAA that covers medical information, you have FERPA that covers educational information or data, but you don't have anything that kind of universally provides blanket coverage. So you have states like California with the CCPA kind of doing their own thing. Illinois has some biometric laws that are kind of unique. They do their own thing there. And there have been movements on a federal level to do more, and those just have come to nothing so far. So first thing is that you have this sort of patchwork of incomplete laws that aren't doing an effective job of regulating. Second thing is that you have government very much in bed with private industry. So you have Google has contracts, Apple has contracts with the federal government, with state governments, and they share data, they share information. So then when you have the government, certainly at a federal level, but even at a state level, trying to regulate what amount to its business partners, it creates certainly, if not a conflict of interest, certainly the appearance of impropriety. I guess I'm uncomfortable with that. And you have examples of that, like Mark Zuckerberg appearing before the Senate, and the senators basically saying, we have no idea what's going on here. We need you to tell us how to regulate you. And that's just very uncomfortable from an optics perspective, and very uncomfortable from a good governance perspective. When you're asking an industry, tell us how to regulate you, tell us what the regulation should be, tell us what you should and shouldn't be allowed to do, because we don't have a clue. We don't even know what Facebook is in the case of some of these older senators, probably. And that's not a position you want to be in from a good governance perspective.
When I was watching, sorry, Aaron, weren't they asking about why do their apps update so much?
Yeah,
that was their concern. Don McKean was like, how do my apps update so much? Like, no, we're not actually talking about your phone book, So
right.
Sorry, Aaron, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think Tom's making this is why I really like working with this team, and this is why the three of us have been able to do so much good work with our student leaders. But Professor Schneider's kind of our expert here on sort of philosophy, politics, and ethics. And so I want him I want to make sure he kind of weighed in on just sort of what are the kind of dangers of a state having this sort of information about its citizens, or being in bed with industry in this kind of unregulated way.
I think the issue is in our normal concerns, we distinguish between the private sector and then the public sphere of government. But in the case of what is being stored here as information or data, it's not so clear if someone says they own data, how it's transferred, how it goes to other people, who possesses it. So it's not as if someone says, okay, I'm in control of this plot of land, and so I have this type of liberty with it. If someone has all the information of your entire web history, or they know all your addresses or so on, it's one thing to say, okay, now they own it, but they could share it and make it everybody's. And when they share it, it's not like it gets diluted. It's not like this information goes away or so on. So a lot of the concepts we have to make sense of private property and to make sense of ownership don't quite work in this case. So I'm not sure if I'm more worried if, say, I would be worried if like a government agency had all my data, and I'm not worried about Apple because, I don't think of Apple trying to arrest me or something like this. But there's no reason to think Apple can't just give it to the government if the government requests. So right now we all know the famous case where Apple says, we're not going to give away the keys. And it's like, hey, Apple decided to do that. They don't have to. And they can do something different than what they say. So it's not clear as if all of our distinctions about public and private are going to be so helpful here. We may need to have new concepts or think of this in a slightly different way.
It sounds like there's a lot of legislation we need to write up for this. Like, this is basically not very protected and uncovered, certainly on a federal level. And we were talking last night about COVID. I think everyone in the audience is much more nervous now than they were last night when we were talking about COVID, because the data privacy, and especially for the millennial generation, is like one of the top issues. So what can we do? So let's talk a little Cambridge Analytica, for instance. I think this is a key case. This is why Facebook came forward. People were on Facebook, which is free, right? And you guys can, this is my understanding, and you can fill me in if I'm incorrect. People would download Farmville, and in the terms of service, it says you give to Facebook your control of your address book and your friends. So you agree to give that information to Facebook. Facebook then turns and sells that to a variety of other people as per the terms of service. And then they get called before the Senate saying, why did you give away all the data? What could have been done better in that situation other than just buyer beware?
Well, I think I appreciate you bringing up Cambridge Analytica, Rob, because it's sort of like the worst case scenario of a thing that happens every day, right? So Cambridge Analytica, of course, famously was involved in the 2016 American presidential election, first on behalf of Ted Cruz, and then eventually on behalf of President Trump. Cambridge Analytica is a British company, but the day after the election, when Cambridge Analytica was on CNN and the news stations bragging about their victory, if you went to Cambridge Analytica's website, you could see that they had already been contracted, sometimes by the federal government, and sometimes have been acting in elections in other countries, right? But you're getting to the point. Nothing that Cambridge Analytica did at that moment was illegal. It's what companies do every day. They gather up your data to send you very precise, targeted ads from what they need, from what they know about you. What was weird about Cambridge Analytica was three things. First off, the fact they were doing it so aggressively on behalf of a presidential candidate. Second, that they were using psychometric data to psychologically analyze the American voter and target issue ads specifically to their psychological paradigm. So on an ethical perspective, that gets really close to sort of propaganda, what we used to sort of worry about in the 50s and 60s, that what we might be doing to other countries. And then the third thing that was sleazy, and I'm just going to say sleazy about Cambridge Analytica, is that they actually, in some ways, used the academic exemption to get a hold of the data. So in other words, the guy who wrote the algorithms for Cambridge Analytica, as of a year or two ago, was still hiding out down in Stanford, and it actually sort of voiced his dismay at how his research had been used over in Europe right after the case broke. But they were basically saying, look, we're academically studying human behavior, which gave them a way to grab the data from Facebook, and then they ended up using it for political and for profit-based reasons. And that situation happens a lot. And I think that's what people don't understand. There are universities that partner with Facebook to do things like find out if your feed is suddenly full of sad news, how happy or sad does the algorithm now think that you are? A major university did that study. They've studied things like, well, what happens when people hover over like or don't like with their mouse but don't actually click it? So I think the other thing that people have to be aware of is when you're using Facebook or Zoom or Twitter or Google, you're also a research participant in this kind of odd social science research that these companies are doing, and that sometimes that stuff is also unregulated because it's not really conforming to the models of academic research that usually force people to get sort of consent and approval for these sorts of experiments. Weirdly, we're all acting like lab rats a lot of times when we're online, and I think that's just another piece of that Cambridge Analytica puzzle that the American population never understood and certainly didn't understand when they signed up for Farmville.
What is the answer to that? Because I don't think the answer is everyone, you need to read your terms of service. You know, I mean, that would be a solution, but that doesn't seem to be the solution that is realistic.
Tom?
Yeah, Rob, I think that the starting point has to be to make the terms of service much more understandable. So terms of service for most websites, for most products you buy, certainly on the internet, when you click through, they could be 20, 30, 40 pages of legalese. They're basically written like insurance contracts. They don't want you to understand what you're agreeing to. So I think there has to be transparency about what data is being collected, how it's being monetized, and who it's being sold to, what it's being used for. These are the very basic types of things that people should be aware of, so that when they're making that transaction and saying, okay, Facebook, I think it's worth it to me to post cat pictures in exchange for all of my data, they at least understand what they're giving up. It's a transparent exchange, and there's consent involved in that. And then if the uses of the data, how it's being monetized, who it's going to, what they're using it for, change, that should be explained to the consumer then too at that point. So I think the keys initially are transparency. You have terms of service that a fifth grader could understand. They're short, they're simple, they're to the point. And you have a knowing exchange of, okay, Facebook is a free service. I want to use it. I want to communicate with people, post pictures, whatever. And I'm willing to give my data up, but I understand what I'm giving up in the process.
And I think Tom's making a really good answer there, because Rob, I completely understand the concern that people with a free market bent say, hey, wait a minute, this was a contract that you signed with Twitter, with Facebook, with Snapchat, with Apple, with Android, with your school, with your city, whatever. but there's just some logistic problems because, again, in our day-to-day activities now, our data is being collected by such a complex array of actors. There's an open question of whether you've actually consented to every conceivable algorithmic relationship that's tracking you every day. But then Tom's getting to this other point, until not just the citizens, but also the legislatures and the regulators and the courts have a better handle of this technology, they can't really predict how to regulate. And so some of our students have actually been talking to Republican and Democratic lawmakers, which is one of the keys, I think, to success on this issue. And what they're telling us is, even when they get a coalition of people together to stop a particular technology, another one just pops up. And what we need is this kind of more meta level understanding of what the issues are, because at the end of the day, no one who joined their Facebook account in 2005 to see their high school roommate knew that someday the data on Facebook could be used to predict your likelihood of being proximate to somebody with COVID, which the federal government has actually just changed some employment rules, and you could actually now be discriminated against you for a job if you have a COVID positive status, and no one knows what to do with like COVID proximate status. But the idea that an informed consumer could ever make that decision about these scenarios that haven't even occurred yet, again, just makes the sort of contract argument meaningless, even for people who really think contracts are important, right? There are bad contracts. There's contracts that are too complex to consent to, and that's why we need new regulation to sort of help out these consumers.
I totally agree. Kind of like on the menus now, they have to put calories, you know.
Right.
And so if you're going to use this option, I would love to see have a non-data collected option. So, for instance, there was the big hubbub with Gmail because they would scan your emails and run targeted ads against you based upon what you said in your email. So if you said, "Hey, let's go sailboating," on your Gmail, then they would send you a sailboat ad. And people are like, "Hey, I didn't consent to have you read my emails." Well, yes, you did, but you're getting it for free, and so therefore they're monetizing the data. It would be great to have. I'd rather pay $10. You know, I'll pay $10 a month for Gmail, and you not collect my data and you not use it. I would love to see a non-data collected option for Facebook too, or any of these things.
The other thing too, Rob, is that most people don't understand the scope of the problem. So I think everybody understands that the Microsofts and the Googles and the Apples and the Facebooks collect data. Domino's Pizza has more people in the data business than in the pizza making business now. They make more money off the data operation from selling the pizzas than they do from making the pizzas themselves. So these companies have figured out how to make data kind of on the back end in a way that's hidden and not transparent at all. And nobody understands that.
Can you say that again? Say the
Yeah.
Domino's thing again. We gotta let that sink in.
Yeah, well, it really shows the scope of the problem. I was at, I teach at Creighton, and I was at the Creighton Business Symposium a couple years ago, where the students bring in all these speakers, and the topic that year was data privacy and data protection. And one of the speakers told me that, and I went to Domino's website, and they're hiring data scientists left and right. And the speaker told me told us all at the symposium that they hire more data scientists than they do people to make pizzas.
So they make more money from the data than they do from pizza.
That's what he indicated, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, but that's the real growth area.
And I think the other thing we got to think about though, Rob, because again, I think there's like stages of being privacy woke, right? Stage one is acceptance. Yes, they are taking my data. Stage two is, what political principles did I enter into this conversation with that can still work? And for a lot of us, it's like, okay, the market can solve this. One of my favorite examples is, it's a TV maker. I'm not going to say their name in the thing, but we could send anyone the news story if they want. There's a very cheap TV they offer every Christmas. It's giant, it's pretty, it's beautiful. It's a smart TV. So they sold it. They didn't tell the customers they were stealing the data. They filed a class action suit. They won the class action suit. And so 4 or 5 years later, everybody gets $40 in the mail. What does the same manufacturer do the following Christmas? Sells the same secret smart TVs. But this guy is my favorite person ever, because his public statement was basically, hey, dummies, how do you think I'm selling you a TV for $200? And I think where we get into this kind of trouble is, let's say you are in, for instance, like I am, North Minneapolis. Good luck finding a non-smart TV at Target or Walmart. And in 3 years, good luck ever finding a non-smart TV. And so at some point, because the market has not caught up to the public's appetite not to be surveilled. We're in this really risky moment in the commercial markets where there might be a monopoly of devices, toasters, cars, TVs, whatever, that surveil your data before there's even a chance for competitors to arrive who actually can provide the service without the sort of surveillance for a higher cost. And so I think that's why, again, the market is lagging behind regulation and public appetite, but there's a danger that we might lose the potential ever to have a market that isn't based on data management and surveillance.
Hey, Daniel, who has access? So all this data that's out there right now, is there anything barring certain people from having access, or who has access to our various data sets?
And as far as I know, if you're a company who possesses it, it's your decision what you want to do with it. I mean, that'd be my thought, right? It's as far as I know, it'd be the company policy of who they want to share this data to and how this data gets used. It's their property. You know, they collected it, they've acquired it, and they possess it. One thing I wanted to say on this, I'm not an expert on the legal matters. That's where Tom kind of comes into play. But what I could say is your questions about how to regulate this or how to do this is, one thought is we're all kind of terrified about this idea of regulation of what we say and what we, the type of liberties, the freedom we have on the internet. So this idea of like, well, the government will then regulate our data is quite frightening. But if you think of it sort of on a way of, think about how we had this problem with when electricity was first, when all the homes became electrified and everybody had electricity in the homes, it wasn't a case where the government steps in and says, here's what you can do with electricity and here's what you can't do. The rules were something like, if your house is going to have this, if electricity is going to come in, electricity comes out, it's going to have to come in on certain frequencies, with certain amplitudes, with certain types of cords, certain things to protect it. So instead of trying to think of how do we regulate the data, right, the information, the thought should be something more along the lines of how do we regulate data transfer? So if someone is providing a service on the internet, if they're providing a service to people, there could be regulations of how much data they can acquire, what they can do with it once they possess it. And there should be some sort of like, as you're saying, not just like terms of service that we agree to, but sort of like customer bill of rights, a sense that there are certain things any user of the internet knows they will always have access to. So I know nowadays companies, I'm trying to save face or look good on this, will say, hey, you can see what Google has. And if you periodically check, you can delete it, right? That's nice. But there should be something like a strong guarantee that when I choose to delete my search history, it's really being deleted. And I'm not just getting a screen that says, yay, you deleted it. Or there should be something on the line saying that if a company wishes to sell or make a profit off of this data or use it to a third party, I should be informed. At the time that this transfer is being made. So there are, I think, some ways this can be regulated without going into having some government system actually seeing everything that everyone says or does on the internet.
I think I'm using the word protection rather than regulation. How do we protect people's data? How do we protect people's identity rather than regulate the companies? I think we want to protect the consumer. And we have a question here from Julius. Julius, you are unmuted, and you can talk. Ask your question.
Yeah. So I work at the IDH. I work with McCain a lot, but something that I'm interested in hearing all your opinions about is since we're talking about government regulation of data transferring and whatnot. New Mexico, a couple of weeks back, hired a firm called Descartes Lab to basically track geolocation and then use that to enforce social distancing for COVID and whatnot. So I'm just interested, is this like a bipartisan issue? Like, is this something that, on the state and federal level, we're seeing both parties trying to regulate data transfer, or is this something that one party is lagging in and one party is not? Or kind of what are your opinions about that?
Thank you, Julius. And don't forget, if you want to ask a question, to raise your hand.
I could start with that one. I think for what's actually really optimistic about this moment is that this is the like mid 60s of the civil rights movement for the digital ethics movement and the digital civil rights movement. So it's actually a time of great optimism. And what we're actually seeing here in Minnesota and nationwide, and even in our work with other academics, and even the fact that me and Tom are sitting on the same call agreeing with each other, is that it's this moment where the people on the left and the right do have to sort of put aside some of their pettier differences and say, well, wait a minute, there are some fundamental things that we both sides believe in: freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom of association, privacy, political affiliation, and people are actually joining together to sort of enact legislation to try to solve these problems. I think what's happening at a national level and a local level is the left and the right's constituents look at these issues very differently. So, for instance, in rural areas, they might have suddenly gotten freaked out by the government shutdown. They might be freaked out about thermal surveillance of COVID patients. They might be really freaked out about the fact that mysteriously the state of Minnesota seems to have some access to our cell phone data. So how do you sort of talk to those people and let them see that that issue that they suddenly care about is part of this larger picture of digital rights? And on the left, I think there's progress being made on the idea of like algorithmic discrimination, which is fantastic, but they need to be brought along to see that algorithmic discrimination, in other words, algorithms that reinforce racial or gender disparities, right? Algorithms that we know hire white guys over women, facial recognition technology that doesn't recognize faces of color, criminal justice algorithms that just sort of reinforce the new Jim Crow over and over. Those are key and important issues, but there has to be some work done in letting the left see that that's part of this larger fight for digital ethics and a digital civil rights movement. And I think successful legislation is going to come whenever people can sort of let both of those sides move away from their pet concerns and see how this is all part of like the larger picture of how to fight for sort of more just and more equitable regulations of the technology.
Tom, do you see this as a partisan issue? I would be unaware of that.
I see it as extremely bipartisan. I think people are just struggling with what to do about it. So every time this gets addressed on a federal level, you get to kind of an impasse, and it isn't that the Republicans think we should do it and the Democrats think we shouldn't in terms of regulation or vice versa. It's that the logistics kind of overwhelm them. A lot of our elected leaders don't have any technical expertise in this at all. You know, Chuck Grassley became kind of a joke along with some of the others at that Senate hearing I was talking about with Mark Zuckerberg. They don't understand the technology. It could be a generational thing. It could just be a lack of technical knowledge thing, probably both. But they're uncomfortable regulating things they don't understand. And normally I would say that's a good thing. You don't want people who don't understand technology trying to regulate it. This needs to be regulated. So we need people in the room who know what they're doing. I sent Aaron a link, and I'll post it here in the chat too, about, it's from Breitbart, but basically what they're talking about is how universities are creating what amount to social credit scores for coronavirus. So they're gonna kind of keep an eye on all of your risk factors and monitor you and basically put together scores for you to determine how risky you are. And when you get to that, I mean, it kind of goes to Julius's point, it gets really scary. How much do we want Big Brother watching us? And I get this is a scary time and this is a communicable disease and we need to be safe and be smart, but how much freedom are we willing to sacrifice for that? What's the trade-off there? And that's something we really need to think through.
And I think that example shows really well, Tom, why you need that left and the right coalition, right? Because the folks on the right are going to worry about this from a privacy perspective, but the folks on the left are going to understand this is also a discrimination issue, right? If my 8-year-old daughter gets predicted to have COVID through some sort of ridiculous system, can she suddenly not attend classes like a quote-unquote healthy person? Can she suddenly not get a job like a quote-unquote healthy person? If they're using Bluetooth technology and drones to sort of surveil your proximity to other people with COVID, which is actually happening, well, how long before people start avoiding the populations that we know have a higher likelihood of having COVID, right?
Right.
Like what, I don't want to be Bluetooth proximate to a Latino population because my odds of getting COVID go up 0.02%. So I think what we need to somehow harness is the social justice warriors' understanding of discrimination and encoded discrimination, and then the right-wingers and the Breitbart people's understanding of liberty and privacy. And if we can get everyone to understand that they're worried about the same thing, they're just speaking a different language, we can actually get us back to where we want to be, which is probably like September 10th, or September 8th, 2001 in terms of technology and surveillance and everything else.
Right.
Yeah, I agree. Let's not talk about drones. Drones are going to kill us all. We all know that. So, Katie has a question.
So in terms of regulation and regulating the terms and conditions to make them more legible and more readable to the average user, what would that have to look like in order for people to understand what they're signing up for? What would you guys have in mind for that to become a reality?
That's good.
And I can start on that, I suppose. When I was in the Attorney General's office for the state of Nebraska, I worked in consumer protection, and that's something that we really struggled with was all of these click-through agreements, whether you're buying something online, whether you're using Facebook, whatever, nobody actually reads them. And like I talked about before, they make them complicated, they make them lengthy, they make them very obtuse for a reason. They don't want you to read them. So there aren't any hard and fast guidelines on that or hard and fast rules. Basically what you want, I think, is to make them as short as possible, as transparent and understandable as possible, and as readable as possible. So I'm thinking of something that's maybe maximum a couple pages long, something that's written in language a fifth grader of average intelligence could understand, and something that makes pretty clear exactly what the trade-off is, exactly what you're agreeing to.
I think to follow up on that, and I think this is where me and Tom might have a slight disagreement in sort of, but this is what's good, right? This is why we like working in teams. This is why it's important. I think for me, there's going to be contractual regulation of this in some places, but it's absurd to think that it's going to happen in all areas. Here's a really good example. We have a former student who reached out to us last year. She's a mother of a special needs child. He was 8 years old in the Minneapolis school district, or a district in one of the suburbs. And she wrote me in the class and she's like, McCain, look what the teachers wanted my student to sign. They wanted her 8-year-old student to sign legally this 10-point document before he accepted the use of his school's iPad, which said, among other things, that the student consented to having that data transferred to third parties, that the student understood, the 8-year-old, that anything they clicked on could be used against them in the future. And they actually had language like, what the decisions you make now could affect your future life, or blah, 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 blah. And my argument is, what 8-year-old could possibly understand that sort of agreement? What parent of an 8-year-old can understand that agreement? And it doesn't matter at some point if they're 8 or 28 or 18 or 88, these are absurd questions to even be asking them. Because at the end of the day, these data agreements are, do you agree to let us know everything about you that we can legally, to tell any story about you that we see fit in perpetuity? And I just think that that goes beyond the bounds of what a reasonable contract could bound you to, because at the end of the day, it's binding you to things that haven't even happened in the world yet.
Yeah, I think that's precisely right. That's sort of what I was trying to get at with this idea of how we regulate utilities. We don't expect everybody to become a electrical engineer to figure out how to be safe. We just make sure that certain products, certain things can't be used on the grid. Similarly, there should not be a website that has some sort of contract like that. The person should not be allowed to sign away these fundamental, we could call them fundamental rights as a person, that I'm never going to agree that things I do as an 8-year-old, right, will be held in perpetuity against me by this third party. That's ridiculous. No one would ever agree to that. So we can't just have this type of legal formalism that makes us pretend people really have given up these rights, really have given up this privacy.
Jacob, I see your hand, and I'll get to your question, but I want to follow up with that. That's great if the company or the website is in America, but if this is overseas, how do we regulate that? I mean, Facebook, they'll just move to Ireland, or like Apple, we're an Irish company now. How do you, unless you want to go down a world, a world government track here, which being a conservative Republican, I do not, how do you, is there any way of fixing that issue?
Tom, that sounds like you.
Yeah, the way that it works now is typically if you're going to transfer data to a company in another country, to a government in another country, there's sort of these memorandums of understanding that govern how that can be transferred, what it can be used for, that sort of thing. The problem you have, though, as you do with any legal issue that requires international governance it's really complicated. You have different countries that want to do different things. So, you know, in Europe, you've got the GDPR. In parts of Asia, you have different privacy agreements. In the US, on a federal level, like I mentioned before, you really have nothing other than, you know, HIPAA, FERPA, that type of thing. So it becomes really complicated, and basically it becomes sort of a patchwork where you work through how those transfers need to be made. Realistically, what I think we should do in the US on a federal level is use GDPR as kind of a starting point. There's no need to reinvent the wheel and then just sort of tweak it to make it work for what we're doing. But ultimately, we need some sort of national oversight.
And Rob, I think to follow that up, and I completely understand the concern. I think what people have to understand though is internet, because you're right, our data travels internationally, right? So like we can don't even get started with like the Chinese sort of and 5G, but like at some point we're in a global digital marketplace, right? I mean, it's true. But what we saw when the Europeans have much more stringent regulations on this stuff than we do, and they have some stuff that we might like a right to be forgotten or stronger protections about how your data is sold. And what we saw was when Europe introduced these measures, suddenly American companies and websites were getting blocked over in Europe. Like even the Chicago Tribune couldn't pass Ireland's new data mining standards. So at that point, we have to ask ourselves, well, wait a minute, if the Irish are saying we don't want the Chicago Tribune vacuuming up our data, why do we want this in Chicago? And I think just like any other international industry, whether it's oil, whether it's minerals, whether it's medical devices, different countries have different standards, and the market sort of sets it out. When Europe created stronger regulations, places like PayPal started adopting towards those stronger regulations because they understood it was better for the consumer, and it made more sense than sort of having two separate corporate structures, one to vacuum up all of our data in the United States and another one to sort of deal with it in the legal frameworks over in the European Union. It doesn't mean there's a particular policy that's one size fits most. I just think given the dangers we're currently all facing with privacy, surveillance, etc., I would take a little bit of, I guess we're going to do this like the French do this, than sort of having no regulations over these things at all.
And we're in a weird position now too, Rob, where these companies are almost begging for the federal government to regulate them because they're seeing what like California is doing with CCPA, and then they're looking at what Europe's doing, and if they do any business there, they've got to comply with that also. And they want some predictability. The absolute nightmare scenario for them would be 50 states doing 50 different things, or 50 states even doing 30 different things. They need some sort of uniformity to give their business predictability and to lower their costs, lower their costs of doing business, basically. So you have these companies like Facebook and Amazon that are going to the federal government saying, we will help you regulate us, and we'll try to do it in a fair way, but you've got to do something. We can't have this patchwork. It just doesn't work.
Seems like this is a federal issue for sure, not a state one. Jacob, you have a question. You should be unmuted.
Yes. Can you hear
First
me?
of all, who is this?
Yep. This is actually Joe Jacobs. Yeah.
Oh.
So yeah.
This is my husband.
Yeah. Anyway, I just kind of have an interest. It's more of a question dealing with trying to solve things. You know, the whole issue of privacy. It's not a new issue. I mean, it goes all the way back to the switchboard operators back in the turn of the century. Are there some types of some legal framework historically with analog systems that would offer the user some level of expectations of privacy? For example, was there anything in the past where there was a switchboard operator with a telephone preventing that person from eavesdropping on our phone calls? I'm just kind of curious on what any thoughts on that, or if there's anything already in place that can give the end user some level of understanding of privacy, of an expectation of privacy.
That's good. Thank you.
I could tee that up, and then Tom or Dan, you guys can hop in. So, Joe, I'm actually just got done teaching a media law class focused on privacy, and it's a really good book. It's written by one of the top scholars in the field, and there's two immediate problems. The first is the author himself on his website is basically like, here's what the rules of privacy were. Good luck winning a case with it, but hey, here they are. Knock yourself out. And by the way, my textbook was outdated 3 minutes after I published it, right? So there's this kind of like, yeah, the stuff's there, but what do you do with it? Some of the research that Professor Schneider and Freeman and I work on is sort of updating privacy law and constitutional law to sort of adapt to these standards, but it's an uphill battle because what's happened in a lot of these cases is we have voluntarily given up the rights that we earned in the 20th century, not to be discriminated against at work, to have some semblance of privacy. And then when digital media showed up, we just sort of signed all those rights away. And even the Supreme Court has wrestled with this. In the US v. Jones case, they actually, the court in their concurrences basically say, we kind of don't get what you jokers want. You had all these protections, you gave them all away. We need to hear more from the voters and the citizens about what this new digital ethos of privacy or public or private personas, et cetera, is before we can sort of shape it into constitutional law. But to the short answer to your question is there are privacy principles that exist. The trick has been, outside of a few cases, US v. Alanis and some others, getting the court to understand how you take those analog laws, I really like that phrase that you used, Joe, and transfer them back into digital environments. The court's trying to do that work, but they've signaled to the people that they need our help. Tom, is that making a little bit of sense?
Yeah, and I am in agreement with you, Aaron. I'd like to hear Dan's thoughts on this, but as I'm thinking it through just as we're talking, it's almost like intellectual property to me, where it's sort of this new area of law that continues to develop. And then the law as it's existed traditionally just isn't really equipped to deal with all of the issues, legal and ethical and so forth. So, you know, when intellectual property became kind of an exploding issue on the scene, they borrowed from tort law and they borrowed from property law and they borrowed from contract law and sort of created this new body of law that was sort of a hybrid of all of those things. And ultimately, I think that may be necessary to address the complexity of privacy law. But I'm curious to hear what Dan has to say.
I'm not exactly sure what to say about it. I mean, the question's a good one, Rob. I mean, this is Joe and Rob. To the 2 points is how do we connect this to our legal history or the laws that we have? And one thought is something like this. I mean, there's a way to kind of demystify technology or demystify the appearance that this is all novel. We saw this kind of how legally we found a useful framework is to treat a company, a global company, right? Which we treat as a person. It's an entity, it's a singular thing, it has responsibility. So we say Google's to blame if this happens. Not the workers, not this, but Google, this entity. And so one of the thoughts is we think we should treat these companies that possess this data and transfer this data in the way we treat a person who was gathering information or eavesdropping and then tattling on somebody else. That perhaps if they say something to somebody you wouldn't want them to say, they're actually trying to destroy your life. They're doing something destructive towards you. They're affecting your happiness by spreading rumors or gossip about you that they collected through an algorithm which makes a prediction, which says something statistically about the likelihood that you're a villain or something like that. So I think we could find, and this is why for me as a philosopher it's useful working with people with expertise in law, things in our law and common law and codified US rights that can help us, not by treating this as a brand new technology, but treating it as communication, how we treat the way people speak about each other and how they communicate to each other and how they're responsible for the things that they say in the context they say. So yes, of course, everyone should have the freedom of speech and freedom to say things, but there is a sense in which people are responsible for what they say. And there are ways I think we can hold companies responsible for the type of authority they present themselves as possessing when they say things about other people.
There's a trick with all this because there's just a gravity to the companies that we're working with to do things a certain way. For example, YouTube will, if you're watching Alex Jones, before they cut him off, whatever, YouTube will show you more Alex Jones so that you can stay on longer. Facebook does this incredibly well, you know, maintaining a user engagement, right? Because so they'll show you more of what you want to see, even if you're farther down a certain path than you want to be, and it's encouraging that, you know, these companies are doing what kind of comes naturally, you know, Facebook and YouTube should be allowed to engage the user. If you're watching a right-wing video, well, now you need to watch a Bernie one, to balance it out. That's not reality. Are we just kind of fighting gravity in some of these situations?
I think we have to be really careful with assuming that what's going on is just sort of a natural progression of seeing more of the things we like and less of the things we don't like. Going along with Aaron's point from before, kind of talking about the civil rights aspect of this, some of the research we've done shows that these algorithms have some pretty significant biases. So if you are an African American, you're more likely to see ads about parole or bail bondsmen, and less likely to see ads about upper management jobs, CEO type jobs. And the reverse is true if you happen to be a white person who's using Facebook. So once the algorithm decides what type of person it thinks you are, it makes judgments about what it thinks you'll want to see and won't want to see, what you're interested in and what you won't be interested in, that have some pretty significant racial and gender biases built into those. And that's extremely concerning.
Yeah, talk more about this algorithmic discrimination. I think that's something we're not hearing a lot about. I learned that from Professor McCain. How is this eking into our lives more and more?
Professor Schneider, you want to talk about algorithmic discrimination? I think
you should speak about it. Sorry about that.
So what we're right now, one of the issues, again, when we're trying to get people to understand issues about digital ethics, privacy, people kind of instinctively understand. The First Amendment, they understand. Algorithmic discrimination is trickier for folks, and it's pretty easy to understand. These companies, the business model of Silicon Valley, of big data, is grab as much data as we can about you. It's a concept that they call more. Statistically correlate it any way that we can possibly do. It's called, correlation. Sometimes there's going to be inaccuracies. They call that messiness. But we can squeeze out some kind of future value, right? Which is what they call value. And I think what folks were not understanding is that two things happen. The first is when algorithms are turning all human behavior into ones and zeros and finding statistical correlations, they end up sort of finding statistical correlations that represent the very worst about us, the most racist, sexist, ableist sort of tendencies that we already have that we're trying to fight through as humans. And they reduce everybody, all individuals, to this statistical mean of behavior, right? So suddenly, it doesn't matter what Tom Freeman might do or Daniel Schneider might do or Rob Barrett might do. It just matters like what people like Tom Freeman might do, which could be anything from people who also eat this candy at the gas station, watch these movies on Netflix, click on this stuff. What do people like Rob Barrett do who attend these churches, who are male, etc.? What do people like Daniel Schneider do who sort of teach philosophy or taught in Israel? And I think even being sort of coy and cautious in this conversation, we see how creepy that can become so quickly. And so our research is focused on three things. First, helping even high school students understand what the error rate for an algorithm is, right? If they're going to do facial recognition scanning, how often is it right? How often is it wrong? And if they've made a wrong guess about you, how does it impact your life? Then we look at this question of bias. What information and data is the algorithm using to correlate X and Y, right? So for instance, do we want Netflix to see how long you binged watch something to correlate that to depression, to then sell that to your insurance company, which was a thing that was floated, but then journalists hopped all over it and everyone backed off. Then we sort of think about this idea of storytelling, which is, would you want an algorithm telling this story about a person to another person, right? So do I want North Central University doing thermal scans of students to sell that to an employer database? I probably would not. Do you want Facebook selling the data of who's protesting against the COVID closures in Iowa to the feds? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But what we try to do is break down algorithmic reasoning into these different sort of categories so people can see that algorithmic discrimination isn't just about people of color or low-income people being sort of discriminated against and left out. It's about the fact that everybody who is being digitally analyzed and who's having algorithmic stories being told about them are sort of being harmed, whether they know it or not, every day and how these stories are told. And it's just a question of whether those harms raise up enough to the level where we actually have to regulate.
Well, let me play devil's advocate, though. I mean, isn't that just good marketing? Isn't Google just doing a good job of marketing? You know, we're just marketing to the people based upon what they want. You want to go sailboating? We're going to show you sailboat ads.
And I think that's where it gets interesting. Well, actually, I'll let somebody else take that. How do we sort of address that question?
Well, it affects people on very important levels, though, too, Rob, where there are studies that show that they had an algorithm judge a beauty contest, and the algorithm preferred white skin to dark skin. There are studies that show that Google was using algorithms to screen job applications, and they found that the algorithm preferred white names to black names. There are studies that show that these companies that use algorithms to screen resumes, they determine, like for data science, that's a predominantly male field dominated by white guys, frankly. Well, when they ask the algorithm, okay, figure out who's more likely to be successful, historically, most people who've been successful there have been middle-aged white guys. So that's what it ends up looking for. And then anyone who goes to a women's college, anyone the algorithm thinks is a woman, it then discriminates against. So in practice, when you have algorithms making decisions about people, it's not just as simple as showing them a sailboat ad because they might like sailboats. It's, we're going to show you ads for bail bondsmen because you're black and we think that you're more likely to need one of those than this job as a CEO. Or we're going to show you a job for being a maid or being a nurse because you're a woman and we think you're more likely to prefer that than you are to want to be a doctor. And you get into these biases that are much more alarming.
So I'd like to add on that. So when you bring up this distinction of, is it just good marketing? With marketing, you have an example of success, right? My marketing worked if the person bought the product. But if I have an algorithm which is meant to detect who will be the most successful, who is the most beautiful, what's the standard for that? Well, what means most beautiful? We think, because it's an algorithm, that somehow it's objective. It's not. It's just reflecting the biases of the programmers who are coming up with the values or the quantities they think makes a beautiful person or they think makes a successful CEO. So you have this algorithm which is purporting to give you an objective output of the best teacher, best CEO, best boss, when all it is doing is corresponding certain biases or opinions of different people who are already part of this programming idea, what they think the best person would be, and then judging people by it. So it's a more dangerous bias than simply having someone pitch you certain movies based off your ethnicity. It's someone saying, well, you can't be a good teacher because you have the wrong skin color. That's what's ridiculous about it. That's why it becomes a real problem.
And I
The
think
beauty isn't in the eye of the beholder; it's in the eye of the algorithm.
right, and I think to elucidate Dr. Schneider's thoughts here, it's we can see how this affects things even as silly as art. So let's talk about art, economics, and then sort of how you survive COVID. My students for years, my African-American students, we have an activity where everyone brings up their Netflix account, and lo and behold, my African-American students seem to be getting a lot more recommendations for Medea and other sorts of elements of Black culture than I am. And on the one hand, you say that's fine, but if my library up here in North Minneapolis only had copies of Jet Magazine, we would obviously see what the problem with that is. Then you go to the realm of economics. Our students did a training exercise with the Little Earth Native American community last year, and this really smart kid, Rob, was making your arguments. He was saying, look, man, if I like something, they should target advertising back towards me. What's the problem? And one of the elders took him aside and said, if all you've ever seen is garage sales, you don't know what the mall looks like. In other words, if you've been so socioeconomically micro-targeted that you don't even know what the possibilities of economic life are, then you don't know what you're missing out on. And the third issue is, now that we have COVID, we see that this targeted information is a life and death matter. Because, look, I think Alex Jones and Joe Rogan are hilarious, but if that means that I'm in a filter bubble where I only see news that says COVID is a hoax, then I can get killed and my family members can get killed. So I think what we see is, even with things as banal as art, it's not innocuous. With economics, we can see how this sort of systemic inequity gets re-encoded. And now that we're in this post-digital, post-COVID moment in America, we can see how dangerous it is to have people occupying totally different worlds, totally different realities when it comes to basic information, what's true and what's false.
There's another question from the chat. Here, Katie.
This is from Jim. What counter messages do you use or recommend? Signal, Privacy Badger, Firefox instead of Chrome?
Can I do if somebody has something, that's fine. Otherwise, I have a standard line.
Go for it.
I would say this. Well, my favorite interview Stephen Colbert ever did, it's the only time I ever saw him break character. It's when he had the Snapchat creators on, right when Snapchat was created. And he was trying to, in character, sort of say, so let me get this straight. We're gonna give you our pictures and you're gonna delete them after a month. And they're like, we're gonna totally delete them after a month. And he's like, you're really gonna do that? And they're smirking and he's smirking and he finally got frustrated. And of course they didn't delete the pictures, right? So I think professionally, the reason I'm always hesitant to ever recommend a particular technology is because without being involved on the ground level with that technology, I don't want to say that Privacy Badger guarantees this or one of these other technologies guarantees that. Having said that, I think the Electronic Freedom Foundation is an interesting organization. I think they traditionally do good work. So some of the tools they have on their site, I think would be a good place to start.
Good. Another question here from Julius. Go ahead. You are unmuted.
Yeah, I kind of want just to circle back to algorithmic discrimination. One of the projects we were working on over at IDH was with HUD and the Little Earth community. So the Housing and Urban Development Department started using algorithms, and then they put in these rules basically saying, long story short, making it legal to discriminate using algorithms against people that are trying to go into subsidized housing. So like, in your guys' opinion, from what you know, why are we, is this like an issue that's gaining traction, like algorithmic discrimination? Or how is HUD run by African-American, I should mention as well, getting away with legally discriminating against people through algorithms?
Let me broaden the question just a little bit more because I care about this a lot. We've been talking a lot about companies with data. What about the federal government? That scares me a lot more. Aaron, you and I talked about this. I don't have to give my data to Apple. I can opt out of my Apple products and not use them. You cannot opt out of the federal government. You know, you can opt out of a state, you can move, but we can't opt out of the federal government. And so I think that's the most terrifying at all. What would you like to see put in place, along with the HUD discussion, protections for the data with the federal government? What can they use it for? What can they not use it for? What can they gather? What can they not gather?
So, I mean, let me kind of set the table here for my two colleagues. I think with this HUD case, what's interesting is that classically in sort of when the federal government's offering people housing, they can't discriminate against people by race, class, gender, religion, all those protections that we typically have with the federal government. What happened with HUD is they introduced a policy change rule that said they could use algorithms to screen clients, okay? They said that those algorithms could use a host of third-party data to help them make decisions about those clients. So, okay, the algorithm can't say no African-American applicants, but maybe it looks through Spotify to see what kind of music they're listening to, and maybe it sees what neighborhoods they come from, and maybe it looks at their faces and whatever else. And what became alarming to us is it seemed like it was one of the first times that the feds, intentionally or not, were trying to go around equal protection laws that were in place for a pretty good reason. And the rule itself was written in a way that you couldn't actually challenge the algorithm. Like, you didn't ever get to see what the algorithm was. And the policy just basically said, the government's going to keep a list of good algorithm companies. And if it's on the list of good algorithm companies, tough luck. And so for us, that kind of raised questions about transparency and algorithmic governance. And I think Tom probably knows a lot more about sort of why transparency is so important in these legal contexts, and Professor Schneider knows quite a bit about the dangers of sort of ceding democratic processes totally over to algorithms. But
well, and the appeal is that, on a surface level at least, is that you have these machines, you have these computers, you have these algorithms that can make decisions about people, or decisions about applications, or in this case, whether somebody is entitled to housing, in a way that is far faster and has the appearance of objectivity, which is something that Dan kind of touched on earlier. It's not necessarily objective. It's that the subjectivity of it, the biases are kind of hidden in the programming, so to speak. So these people put this trust and faith in the algorithm to make decisions in a fairer way, in a more equitable way than humans could, but they don't really understand how the decision's being made, how the algorithms work. And then as Aaron mentioned, they don't even want you peeking behind the curtain now, and that's extremely problematic. So now if you have an algorithm that has some biases built into the coding, some biases built into the decision-making, you can't even question it or challenge it. And some of these algorithms now, not just in the housing context and the HUD context, but just generally, are so complicated that even the programmers can't explain them. So even if they were required to try to explain, they wouldn't be able to explain why the algorithm made a decision, why in this context it preferred one housing applicant to another. There may just not be anybody who can explain that decision.
So yeah, I agree with what Tom said. And I think one of the questions is what should be done about it? What would we want? So transparency is very high on the list. There should be demand that what the inputs that go into the algorithm should be known to people, and the weighting that comes out to. This idea of proprietary algorithms is a problem. Now, if we have proprietary algorithms where it's owned by somebody, so nobody can see under the hood, see how it works, there should still be this notion of responsibility for if they use the algorithm. So if HUD uses this algorithm and they make decisions off it, and it can then be shown through a court case that they did something discriminatory, peoples should be responsible. Human beings should be responsible for it. The agency should be responsible for it. The idea that we just have a machine do it, and then machine doesn't feel bad, the machine doesn't have shame, the machine can't be argued with. No, a person has to do the stamp of approval, and they should be, the buck has to stop somewhere with the person. I think that's the most fundamental thing. So it's a problem with any bureaucratic apparatus in the world, is you try to tell somebody, you try to find out who's responsible for what. Everybody passes it around, and so the person who's trying to be served by the bureaucracy gets nothing. So one of the big things that has to be done is these algorithms can't take over and be the responsible agent. There has to be a person ultimately who has to be responsible for it and has to make sure that this type of bias doesn't occur or doesn't creep in to the system.
Hey, that's good stuff. Thank you guys so much. You guys write me up a data bill of rights and I'll take it up the hill.
All
Get
right.
this done.
Sounds good.
Protection. So thank you all for coming. Tomorrow night is, we're gonna be joined by Sarah Renner and Nate Saban and some other musicians. We're gonna talk about how do we do creativity in this world and protect it. Copyright and those kind of things. How does that work in our new world, the intellectual property that we just talked about? So thank you so much. And we will record these and post these. We have recorded them and we will post them coming forward. But Professor McCain, Professor Freeman, and Daniel, thank you so much for coming. It's a blast to be with you. And this is the issue. This is the issue people can get fired up about.
Somebody should run for Senate on this issue, Rob.
Sorry, say that again?
Someone should run for Senate on this issue.
I'm in. I'm in. Hey, you guys, thanks so much. Blessings to you. But thank you all for coming, and we'll see you tomorrow night.
Thank you so much,
Appreciate
Rob.
it. Thank you.